All right, so I think we'll get started. I've been giving presentations for the last several weeks and having such a wonderful time, but I thought that maybe you're getting a little tired of me, so I took the opportunity to bring on a dear friend who will take over presentation today. And she has a wonderful presentation on the issues involving community engagement, and I know that's something that a lot of you people do when you do research, especially in the outlying areas. So give control. I'm sure there's a better word. I give control over to Veena Pillai, if I'm pronouncing that right, but I will let Veena give a short introduction of herself, and then she'll continue with her presentation on community engagement. So, Veena, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Henry. Let me just share my screen and start my presentation. It has my introduction on it. Okay, so as Prof. Henry said, today we're going to be talking a bit about community engagement, and I had a look at all your research topics and things like that, and it seems that you certainly are already doing community engagement, and I'm not sure if that's with universities or with NGOs, but either way, I'm sure you're engaging with community. So hopefully this will be a refresher, or putting some theory into it. So a little bit about me. Can you see if I have this up? I work primarily with two organizations. One is my own, Diode, and the other is Médecins Sans Frontières. We have quite a strong presence in Myanmar, so I think people would have heard about Doctors Without Borders there. And I have my own company which does a lot of research with vulnerable and marginalized populations. So between these two organizations, I actually do a lot of clinical care, as I'm also a medical doctor, and research for vulnerable and marginalized populations, namely HIV positive persons, transgender persons, sex workers, LGBT community, refugees, undocumented persons, migrants, prisoners, and detainees. Doing all these research projects, we suddenly realized that a lot of ethical issues were coming up, and it hadn't been caught by the traditional ethics review boards because there were no community members on the ethics review board to bring in local context and understand the kind of difficulties that these marginalized populations face. So we created a specialized ethics review board for marginalized populations, which is independent, but housed under University Malaya. And for that, we are also training community members so that they can also be part of the ethics review process for projects happening in their community. So today we're going to be talking about why community engagement is ethical, as well as the ethics of community engagement. And by the end of this module, you'll be able to define the spectrum of community engagement, understand the principles, explain why it's an ethical benchmark of global research, as well as discuss the ethical considerations that we must consider when we are engaging with community. We start with an introduction, go into community engagement, think about why is it ethical, why is it effective, and then we'll go over some case studies, because I'm sure by then you'll be sick of hearing me speak. So community engagement is increasingly recognized as a critical element of the global research. It is becoming an ethical requirement, so much so that we will need to justify if we are not including community in our research. It is expected, and it should be expected. That's the correct thing. The problem with that is that when something becomes a requirement, sometimes it becomes like a check mark on a checklist. And we run the risk of doing what is commonly known as tokenistic community engagement, as in, just checking a box that we talked to a couple of community leaders, and we did that. So it's really important to focus on meaningful community engagement. This is recommended by ethicists, required by research funders, and advocated in many ethics guidelines. And community engagement is interpreted in different ways over research domains using different definitions and models. So we're not going to be learning like one community engagement model, but more trying to think about how we will look at the community to understand what is the best community engagement model required. So what is community engagement? It's a very, very broad term. And actually, because of the diverse nature of communities and the method of engagement, there's actually no universally accepted definition of community engagement. In fact, there's actually no real definition of the word community. But for research, we can define groups by so many different ways. But for research purposes, this definition by McQueen and al. Has been used quite extensively in community engagement, which is a group of people with diverse characteristics who are linked by social ties, share common perspectives, and engage in joint action in geographical locations or settings. So the common elements you'll see here is a sense of place, sharing common interests and perspectives, joint actions that bring people together, as well as social ties. So the concept of engagement in research goes beyond just simple community participation. It is actually working collaboratively with partners who share common goals. We need to think of the research population, participants, funders, all as equal stakeholders. I say equal, but actually the community should have a higher stake because they give more to this research. Community engagement, it involves a mutual respect. If you feel like you are not having a two-way street of respect, it will really be difficult to engage purposefully. We probably are aware, if you've been talking about ethics and global research, we already know that there's a long history of researchers disrespecting communities, the powerful, the rich, using vulnerable communities for research, like, for example, drug trials in developing countries. And this is why we have ethical rules. So respecting the community is a cornerstone. It's of utmost importance. But at the same time, if they do not respect what you want to do, the research you want to do, or your research team, you may have to try an alternative approach because you're not going to have any meaningful, it's not going to be effective. The community engagement won't be effective if you are not feeling that the work you're doing is respected. In terms of power sharing and equity, when we think of community leaders, participants, funders as equal stakeholders, we must consider what equity they have in this. Consider the benefit that they will receive and whether they understand that benefit and they accept that as a benefit. And that brings us straight into mutual benefit. A few years ago, a colleague and I decided we're going to employ the benefit of the population more than the benefit of the researcher ideology, and only do projects that benefit the population more than they would benefit the researcher. But it actually was really hard to do. I don't think we have actually done it yet, because for the benefit for the researcher, it's already predetermined. We're going to have publications, we're going to have funding, we're going to have maybe a higher position, maybe we'll be sent on conferences. We really benefit from a lot of research. Whereas benefits for the community during research are often potential or theoretical. Aside from compensation or incentives, the benefit can sometimes be a little bit uncertain. And if the community cannot see this benefit as real, they're unlikely to be engaged to a level that is needed for the research to be effective. So the extent to which a community cohesiveness is one of the measures that you can use to decide what kind of community engagement model you want to have. So the extent to which a community reflects these features is a measure of its cohesiveness. Do they self-identify as a community? Do they share common culture, tradition, knowledge, history? Do they have a health-related common culture? Is there a legitimate political authority to even go to a representative group to understand if this research is suitable? Is there a common geographic localization, and do they share a common communication network? So understanding how these factors play in the community and understanding the level of cohesiveness would make us understand what different research protections and community engagement models are necessary. So depending on the level of cohesiveness, you might ask for consultation and protocol development, information disclosure about proposed research, and involvement in disseminating the information. So these are the kind of things you can look at when you are starting out in a new community to understand better how you're going to engage them. And before I was speaking about active, inclusive participation being a key to community engagement. So intersectionality, I'm not sure if this is a very common phrase that you've heard, but it definitely is becoming increasingly talked about. It's a framework to understand how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create modes of discrimination and privilege. It brings attention to how people are defined by different positions in the society based on gender, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, ability, and class. They are, for example, a white woman and a black woman may face different types of oppressions, despite both being women and facing oppressions of women. A migrant worker in Malaysia, a migrant worker from the US may be treated very differently from a migrant worker from Indonesia, despite both of them being migrant workers. So they are in hierarchical relations to one another, according to which some people have more power in societies than others. And so we need to have an intersectional approach to community engagement. And it sounds really complicated.
Veena, quick question. What do you mean by an approach to community engagement?
So basically it sounds extremely complicated, but actually it is just being mindful that every community is different and we'll have sub-communities within them. So when we want to engage community, in a lot of vulnerable and marginalized communities, at least, a lot of the community leaders are male. So an intersectional approach would make sure that we are looking at both genders and making sure that we find the female community leaders as well. Or if we want to think about a different type of sub-community. So sub-communities can be based on race, gender, ability, sexual orientation, money. So let's take people with disabilities. So depending on the research topic, you might want to include a member of the sub-community of people with disabilities. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, but when we think with an intersectional approach, we look at all the different types of ways the communities could be divided and who we might be missing when we are looking for representation. That makes sense.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So community engagement is a very loosely defined term, as we already mentioned, and has many different models and versions. And communities are diverse, and so it takes a little bit of while, but we're just going to go through the different types of community engagement that is you might have heard of already. Sorry, what just happened? Sorry. Okay, so community participation is just involvement of people in community and projects to solve their own problems. So it's a very vague term. It's not very specific and therefore doesn't really tell us much. Collaborative partnership is a collaboration between an academic institution or another entity like an NGO with a community. Community involvement is similar to community participation, and as vague as community participation is, so I don't recommend we use that term. Participatory action research is an approach to research in communities that emphasizes participation and action. Community consultation should be a participatory process, but often it's just consulting with the community rather than the protocol and everything, and just this one is often a very tokenistic process. Community empowerment refers to the process of enabling communities to increase control over their lives. This should be a goal in any community-based research project, but it's not always possible. But at least the ethical principles that we use can sometimes be very empowering in themselves. For example, I found that the process of informed consent is actually very empowering, especially in extremely disempowered communities, for example, like prisoners or detainees who are not actually used to having the option to say no. Community-based participatory research is actually like probably the most ideal method of community engagement in terms of how collaborative it is. It is a partnership approach. that equitably involves community members, organizational representatives, researchers, and all others in all the aspects, starting from picking the research topic to developing the protocol and sharing that decision making, ownership, and responsibility. Our community advisory board is a board of advisory board consisting of representatives of a community who will meet with reps of an institution to review studies or consult on topics. And this is a really great way to increase capacity within the community. So these community advisory board members would ideally be elected by the community to be their representation. So this is also a really excellent way to engage the community. It also is a great way to increase their capacity. If they are reviewing protocols, they are understanding more, they are learning more. It's also a great skill for them to have. So, like I said, community engagement is so broad, it is actually a spectrum. And this is a really great, illustration of how these the spectrum goes from, completely ignoring the community straight to community ownership. So we're obviously looking at the far right as ideal, but community engagement can't just be jumped into. It depends on the community's cohesiveness, researcher experience, community experience. Of course, the aim should be to have the most collaborative relationship and put the community in power, but I have seen a lot of researchers try to jump to that and become very disheartened and decide that community engagement is not, it doesn't work or something like that. And that's really not what we want. So doing it slowly and doing it carefully is also super important, especially for trust with the community. So if you look at the far left of the spectrum, we have ignore, which means that research is not done. Community is not included in studies at all, and this results in marginalization. What we tell them is that your voice, needs, and interests do not matter. Okay? We move further to the right and we see inform. This is placation, right? We provide the community with information that we feel is relevant. So we are actually keeping the power because we are deciding what information the community needs to know and what they don't need to know. So this might be like, presentations or fact sheets that you might share with the community. Consulting is, again, what I said, tokenization, which we want to gather input from the community. And as here, the community hears that we care what the community thinks. But this is just actually the starting point of community engagement. It's not enough, ideally. And this can come in the form of focus group and surveys. Next, we have involve, which means that ensuring the community needs and assets are integrated in the process and inform planning, so in the whole research process. It could look like community advocacy workshops or interactive workshops to understand what their research priority is. It can also, include focus groups and fact sheets. All these activities are good ways to engage community, but it's with what intention and aim we are looking at. Collaboration ensures that the community has capacity to play a leadership role. So it's not just asking or offering the community to play a role. For example, if you want to have a community advisory board looking at ethics review, you can't just give them a protocol that might be too complex for them. You need to train them how to review ethics. And you must be willing that the community, to ensure that the community has the capacity to participate. You have a responsibility to do this. This is not just a respect. That's not why we do this. We want to tell the community that their leadership and expertise are critical to how we address the issue because they know better how to tackle problems that affect them. They're the ones that are experts in this. So this can look like things like a memorandum of understanding or community advisory boards. The final one, the thing we're all working towards is community ownership, where we foster participation and equity through community-driven decision-making. And this can be through participatory action research or community cooperatives. So let's see where the ones that we've discussed fall into that. So this would be where collaborative partnership is, participatory action research, community involvement between involve and collaborate, community consultation, a little more to the left, that's not ideal. Community participation is kind of an umbrella term, and community empowerment comes to the right of the spectrum as well. And like I said, CBPR is one of the ideal ways of engaging with community. Right. So I'll take a small break from talking right now. And wait, let me try. We'll do our first quiz. Okay. So can everyone see that last link for the S2 one? Yeah. Can you click on that and complete there's 3 examples of research studies, and you have to just choose what kind of model it is. To make it a little easier for you, I've put in the definitions of all the models on here. Okay, maybe we can go over the responses now. Okay. Everyone can see this, right? Okay. So the first one is an implementation research study involving a health passport intervention for Indigenous communities, and they will be holding a pilot test of a study through a focus group with community leaders before finalizing the design and carrying out the intervention. What type of community engagement model is this? Yes. So majority of people, 60% got this correct. This is community consultation, as they've already created the intervention, and they are just getting a consultation with the communities before carrying out the intervention. The large part of the work has already been done. There is some participatory research aspect. So I see that 22% of people wrote CBPR, and there is an aspect of that because we are asking them to be part of the design of the tool. The issue here is we're asking them at the very end. And, we've already created something and we're asking them at the end, which makes it more of a consultation. It is empowering the community to, be part of this, but it's a very small part of it. And this is not technically a community advisory board because that is a formalized committee. Good. The second one is a study exploring SGBV survivors coping with domestic violence. Was carried out with the female community leaders of the community. The community leader was a co-investigator of the study. The methodology was developed through interactive workshops with the community and will employ a storytelling method to understand the lived experiences of the participants. So this is technically community-based participatory research, but I see 40% people wrote collaborative partnership, and that is also true. It is collaborative, and there is an informal partnership here, but technically the collaborative partnership is usually between an institution and the community, and it probably is collaborative partnership here, but it's not really mentioned in the question. So I think the most correct answer would be CBPR. Third, a research team is planning to carry out HIV screening amongst migrant population. They have done several studies with the same population, and through those studies have established a committee of individuals with the knowledge and expertise to represent the community needs. And the HIV screening study will be reviewed by this committee before being rolled out. And half the people got this correct. This is a community advisory board. It is also technically community consultation and all the other things as well, but the correct model of this is community advisory board. They are all same. They all overlap. So all these answers are actually correct, but the most correct model that matches the study are these. Great. Okay. Any questions on that? I know this is a difficult forum to take questions, but if there are, please feel free to.
Or they could, since I could serve as the moderator, if somebody wants to put a chat in, I will monitor the chat.
Great. Yeah.
Okay. I will be your voice.
That will be great. No one said anything yet, right? I'll continue.
Okay.
All right. So why is community engagement an ethical approach? Firstly, it respects individuals, communities, and stakeholders. Throughout the spectrum, there are different levels to which we can respect individuals. We can either simply acknowledge or inform them, we can consult or we can listen, and of course, we want to collaborate where the researchers are involved as partners, co-develop the study protocols and share responsibilities in conducting research. As mentioned before, collaboration requires time. It requires money and sometimes training. And these are things that researchers often don't budget for. So this is an important thing to know. Community engagement in a respectful way takes time and sometimes takes money too. So training is a super important part of respecting individuals, as we said. A true respect would be training them to be able to do what we expect them to do in community collaboration. Community engagement also supports the consent process, and this is, of course, part of autonomy and respect for persons, and it's also, of course, a critical ethical element of research. And the process is enhanced by community engagement through increasing understanding of what the study is. Having a community understanding of what the study is will already give you a step in the right direction. And the community representatives or the community itself, like doing focus groups with the community, will help you understand what a true informed consent is. So what kind of language it needs to be in, what kind of forms it needs to be. And they'll tell you that in accordance to language and cultural protocol. Like with the Rohingya refugee community, we can't translate consent forms. We can't do that because there's no widely known written form of the language. So that needs to be done in a different way, maybe through audio recordings or having the participant feed back to us. But that's something that traditional ethics review boards may not accept. And it can get quite complicated in that way, but that's what the community can tell us. Building trust and social relationships, community engagement bridges the gaps that communities may feel between themselves and the researcher. Particularly with vulnerable communities, there's often a power dynamic between researchers and communities. I think we talked about, or you probably talked a bit about it during your vulnerability talk. And sometimes this power dynamic and this gap can sometimes prompt suspicion and resentment if the benefit of the research is not fully understood. So if interactions are just short and managed, the trust may not be built. Of course, on the flip side, building trusting relationships can be a little bit difficult, especially if you are healthcare institutions, and the therapeutic misconception may arise, as Prof. Henry mentioned in his talk a couple of weeks ago. The next thing is determining appropriate benefits, minimizing risks, burdens, and exploitation. No one will know better the benefits needed and the potential risks facing them than the community and those working closely with the community. Understanding proper reimbursement and compensation for time demands of the study, and also ensuring that participants are not unduly burdened. Even if the study goes through ethics review board, they may not know the local context and what the appropriate beneficence is. The risk analysis and beneficence analysis is becoming increasingly important and talked about in terms of community engagement. So in terms of vulnerabilities, and again, I don't want to go into this too much if you guys have already had a session on vulnerabilities, but traditionally vulnerabilities have been put into groups like pregnancy, children, prisoners, and but we are starting to learn that there's a lot of nuance in that. And traditionally, if someone is vulnerable, they were not included in study. And so now we have a lack of evidence in vulnerable groups because of that. And so now what we need to do is learn from the community who is vulnerable, why they are vulnerable, and what we can do to put in protections for them. Capacity building and empowerment also community engagement also leads to capacity building and empowerment. And at its most basic, it's just exposure to the work being done, but at its best, it's training community members in research skills, being co-investigators, and that also opens up job opportunities for community members. So one of the things my company does is we run research skills workshops for community members so that they can be the research assistants within the research team and be actively participatory in the process. And also justice, ensuring a fair distribution of benefits. So why is community engagement an effective approach to research? So gaining permissions might be easy if you're taking it just from the ethics review boards or your university or anything that's a formal institution, but getting informal permissions from gatekeepers or chiefs and things like that can be a bit more difficult, but with previous community engagement that might be a little bit easier. And achieving recruitment and retention targets can often lead to failure of research projects, which is a waste of resources, and maybe putting the participants at unnecessary risk or potential side effects. Community engagement has already been identified in many studies to increase recruitment and retention for studies. And of course, the most important thing is building a relationship with the community to understand future research areas so that we are always doing research that is relevant to the community. Okay, so if we come to the next quiz. Is there a question? I see something in the chat. Oh, okay, CBPR is community engagement model. Or would CBPR be a more all these are models in themselves. These are all different types of community engagement models. So CBPR is a community engagement model, and it's also a method used in the models on the right side of the spectrum. But the most important thing to understand is community-based participatory research is at the far right of the spectrum. It is the most collaborative and provides the most ownership to the community. I don't know if that's really answered your question, but please continue. Okay. To conduct participatory research and to use the community engagement models on the right spectrum, it requires more resources. How do we engage with the partners and persuade the donors? This is a really good question, and I feel like it's clear that you work in an NGO from this question because I also work in NGOs, and this is something that's really difficult for us because we have to budget in more time and we need to budget in more money. And it is very difficult for funders to understand that. But there is a lot of evidence showing that community engagement is ethical and effective. So what funders want to hear is the effectiveness. So if you look at the amount of studies that prove that it increases retention and recruitment and will more likely result in a more effective study, maybe they'll change their minds and they might be willing to increase it. I have found that just putting it into the budget is usually acceptable, especially since globally it is becoming something that is necessary to be done. I hope that answers your questions, but yeah, that's how we've been doing it here in Malaysia. We can talk later as well if you want to talk more about what we've done here and what's worked. Okay, so now we go into the second group. So can you see that first link with the GDVV? Yeah. If you click that one, you'll come up with the case studies. So just spend a little bit of time and go over the case studies. They're a little bit long and the answers are a little bit long, but that's because community engagement is quite complicated. All these research studies and case studies I'm presenting have been done, and these have actually happened. So spend a little bit of time answering that, and then we can discuss it as a group. Okay, I think everyone has answered. You are an SGBV researcher and about to embark on a study concerning SGBV. Your study is looking at the coping strategies of women survivors of SGBV among a minority ethnic group. You know someone in this area and they pass you a contact. He passes you Mr. CL's name and he arranges with 2 other community leaders. When you meet them, they tell you that this research is not relevant for their community and their main concerns are NCDs. What would you consider? So an overwhelming majority has said that they would keep holding interviews with community to ensure proper representation. So this is what we talk about when we're talking about a true representative, an inclusive representation. When we ask male community leaders about their opinion on SGBV, we cannot just take their opinion and take it as, you know, the full opinion of the community, because there may be reasons why they don't want you to come and explore this topic in the community. So it's super important to be finding some female community leaders and getting some proper representation. And I think this is a problem that we fall into a lot, where we are like, we want to engage community, and of course we want to respect community opinion. And so that's super important, but we also want to make sure that we are looking at all the different features and aspects, and we are doing things ethically. So it's not just about blindly respecting and blindly listening, but to be mindful of all the different intersections within the community. And it is correct, SGBV is prevalent everywhere. So it would be good to also ignore that opinion, but maybe not obviously disregard, but do it in a diplomatic way, saying, I'm going to, expand my interview base. Hey, good. Looks like everyone understood that quite clearly. Case study 2, you're a researcher looking at TB and malaria. You would like to do a quantitative survey looking at risk factors among urban refugees. You have hygiene kits in your NGO just lying there waiting to be distributed. When you present your study and the idea of compensation, they said, nobody needs these essential items. They're going to think that's not, important. What they really need is cash, and that is what people find valuable. Which of the following do you consider? So 40% said that they would follow the community leader's advice and change it to a cash compensation. 25% said they would feel uncomfortable because it may lead to corruption. 15% said they would be uncomfortable as they don't know what they will spend the money on. And 20% said they would not want to waste the hygiene kits and leave. So all these questions and all these answers are really going to be dependent on your kind of understanding of ethical principles. And the most important thing to understand is don't make decisions by yourself. Talk to your group, talk to your NGO, talk to the ethics review board if you can. Try to understand what is the most ethical by not making a decision only by yourself. So I just want to point out one thing, that if in terms of the discomfort of giving cash, that is something that is really common, especially for funders. They find it very uncomfortable to be just giving cash out. They'd rather a food voucher or something like that. And that's understandable. But when you engage the community, there must be an element of trust. And that's what I wanted to bring out in this case study, that yes, it may be uncomfortable, but it actually it's not up to us to decide what they buy with their cash anyway. But this is not a black and white answer. There are a lot of people who feel differently about this, and I would just encourage people to discuss it with people. So case study 3, you are conducting a quantitative survey on drug use among homeless population. To compensate for time spent on the survey, you provide a small amount of cash. You connect with the shelter leader who is keen to support the study. You are so impressed with her ability to pull in participants. So you don't go to any other shelters. You're like super happy with this because you can get all your sample size at this one shelter. But then during one interview that you happen to be doing an interview, a participant reveals to you that the shelter leader, in agreement to doing this interview, is taking 50% of the compensation money from each participant. So if they don't give, if she doesn't give the 50%, she won't allow them to be in the shelter. So what do you do? So 45% said report the incident to the ethics review board responsible for your study. 25% said confront the community leader immediately, remove her involvement in the study, and continue recruiting participants. And 30% said they will do all of the above, including pay the affected participants the remaining portion and call the police. Again, this is a really tricky one. Calling the police with vulnerable populations can be a little bit tricky because of harm to the potential participants as well. Confronting the community leader may result in the participants being affected. They may get kicked out of the shelter if she feels angry that they, told on her. So this is a really complicated one, but definitely you should report the incident to the ethics review board. But again, you go to your group and you try to figure out what's the best way to make sure that the participants are being paid fairly. But just on that, I just wanted to go over a few lessons learned, because this actually happened to me. So I learned a lot from this particular incident. And one of the most important things is pay people for the work they do. So this community leader felt that she was owed 50% of the incentive because she was working really hard. trying to get all these community members in, arranging it, making sure people are there, making sure the chairs are arranged, there's enough space. It was a lot of work. There was refreshments. She did a lot of work. So she felt entitled to this money. Of course, it's wrong. I'm not trying to say that this was the right thing to do, but if I had compensated her for that time and work, maybe this might not have happened because I would have respected her work, right? I wouldn't have, we can't assume community will just help and they have to make a living themselves. To be more present and engaged in the study, these things, the only reason we found out about this was because we were there. We didn't leave it for the RA to do and things like that. We made sure we were present and engaged. And also never let one leader monopolize a site. Because if there were more sites, the participants could have gone to another site if they were not happy with the site, if they knew that there was some corruption happening at the site. So always spread out your community leaders and spread out your community sites. Okay, so any questions on that? Did any questions come in? So what are the ethical considerations when you engage with community? I'm not going to talk about intersectionality again, because I think we've mentioned it a couple of times, but we can often oversample a population. So what happens is when we have 2 or 3 really effective, really engaged community leaders, we tend to use them again and again. But they are only representative of a small portion of the community. And so what happens is we sample the same community and then we can come up with like the wrong conclusions because we keep on sampling the same population. And that can also lead, using the same community leaders, and often what we do is then we share those community leaders to other people. So the same people get used again and again. And that can often lead to gatekeeping. So if people really want to enter our studies, they might end up having to pay people to enter because they know that only these 2 or 3 community leaders are being used, which can lead to abuse of power and corruption too. The timing of community involvement, this is something that is a real pitfall. And already we mentioned a little bit that the timing should be from the start of the research protocol, from the choosing of the topic. That will be the best way to avoid any ethical issues with community engagement. Tokenization, we have to consider the diversity between populations and, of course, inadequate capacity building. For example, if you're training prison guards to do your informed consent process and you don't train them in voluntariness of the consent process, then that can lead to people maybe being forced to go into your study. It can be a major issue. Finally, the goals of community engagement is to ensure the relevance of research, to assess whether research is culturally and practically acceptable in the context it is intended, to ensure that community disruption is minimized, to avoid exploitation by ensuring a fair distribution of benefits, and to take into account ethical hazards that may be a part of the social, economic, and political landscape of the community. So begin community engagement as early as possible. Include it in timelines and budget. Engage meaningfully, don't do it tokenistically. Take an intersectional approach and trust the community. Make sure you're increasing the capacity community in both research and research ethics. And that's the end of my presentation. Did anyone have any questions?
Okay. You can unmute yourself. Yes, right. Very good. Yes. Okay. We're trying to replicate the face-to-face experience, even for the presenter. Okay.
Thanks.
We don't want to see those jaundiced hands waving up. Okay. Enough of that. Okay. All right. That was excellent. Veena, that just really, you really explored the whole spectrum of community. I was going to use the word engagement, but gosh, I never thought there were so many terms attached to community. I'm going to have to really bunker down and really get even more familiar with these terms.
Thank you, Veena and Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Veena.